North Atlantic, 0415 hours, 4 July 1961. Submarine K-19. The pressure gauge in the starboard VMA reactor's primary loop registered 0. Within hours, core temperature estimates approached 800 degrees Celsius, despite an automatic scram insertion. The long-range radio set had already failed. Rescue could not be requested. The control room log would soon record doses measured in sieverts, not millisieverts, for the men sent to restore cooling. A post-Cold War summary notes that a non-standard cooling system was assembled using the onboard freshwater reserve, under orders of the ship's command, a decision that stabilized the reactor at the cost of human life. The contrast was stark. A first-generation ballistic missile submarine designed to deter with redundancy and procedure instead depended on improvised welding in a radiologically hot compartment. 8 sailors would die of acute radiation syndrome within weeks. Decades later, the dumped reactor compartment would be located in the Kara Sea, finally linking the at-sea emergency to its long-term environmental footprint. Spring through summer 1961. Northern Fleet Headquarters, Polyarny Naval Base, Kola Peninsula. The new Project 658 submarine, NATO reporting name Hotel Class, represented the culmination of strategic ambition and compressed timelines. Commissioning rosters listed approximately 139 aboard. The platform carried twin VMA pressurized water reactors and 3 R-13 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Design philosophy emphasized redundancy. 2 independent reactor plants, compartmentalized systems, overlapping safety features. The intent was patrol endurance, strategic deterrence, and operational secrecy under Arctic and Atlantic waters. Reality diverged. Pre-commissioning reports documented mishaps during construction at Severodvinsk. Quality assurance concerns appeared in open histories. Crew slang reputedly nicknamed the boat Hiroshima, a colloquial signal of confidence gaps. One later technical synopsis would note plainly, a backup system included in the design was not installed. That single emission, emergency core cooling, would define what followed. Captain First Rank Nikolai Vladimirovich Zateyev held command. Engineering division officers oversaw the twin VMA loops, pressurizer, main coolant pumps, steam generators, control rod mechanisms. Normal operating pressure exceeded 200 atmospheres. Heat balance depended on forced convection through the primary circuit. Emergency procedures for loss-of-coolant accidents presumed either shoreside intervention or the backup cooling system called for in the design specification. Neither would be available in open ocean. Soviet Navy main staff oversight emphasized patrol doctrine, endurance, strategic silence, self-reliance. Early Cold War submarine operations accepted risk in exchange for deterrent effect. The VMA, reactor plant, an early-generation naval pressurized water design, lacked the decades of operational refinement that later Soviet marine reactors would accumulate. The platform was sound in principle. The margin for error was thin. A CIA reading room extract declassified years later would summarize the sequence concisely. Assemble a non-standard cooling system and use the onboard freshwater reserve. That phrase captured both the ingenuity and the irreversibility of what the crew would be asked to do. The very redundancy intended to prevent catastrophe. 2 reactors, 2 steam plants, compartmentalized systems would be undercut by an absent emergency feature. The platform was built for strategic routine. It would instead confront non-routine risk. 0415 hours, 4 July 1961. North Atlantic Exercise Area, southeast of Greenland. The pressure gauge for the starboard reactor's primary circuit began to trend downward. Within minutes, the reading reached 0. Main coolant pumps coasted down without driving head. Automatic protective systems inserted control rods, achieving reactor scram. The fission chain reaction ceased. Decay heat, residual thermal output from fission product radioactivity, continued to drive core temperature upward. Procedure presumed 2 pathways in a loss-of-coolant event: controlled shutdown and tow to a Northern Fleet base for shoreside repair, or activation of the installed emergency core cooling system to maintain adequate heat removal at sea. In practice, neither option existed. The long-range radio system had failed in a separate, unrelated casualty. Communication with Moscow was impossible. Assistance could not be requested. The patrol position remained strategically sensitive. Surfacing protocols restricted disclosure, and the emergency core cooling system specified in the original design had not been installed during construction. Later, technical reconstructions would document two competing attributions for the primary circuit failure. The first, a micro-crack in a primary piping weld, stressed beyond yield at operating pressure above 200 atmospheres, propagated by thermal cycling and inadequate quality control during fabrication. The second, overpressurization during initial startup testing, with transient pressure spikes reportedly approaching 400 atmospheres, sufficient to weaken heat-affected zones near welds. Both accounts appear in open sources. The record preserves the dispute without resolving it definitively. Reactor division officers assessed the leak location. Zateyev weighed the options. Without forced convection, decay heat would drive fuel cladding temperatures toward failure thresholds. Zirconium cladding begins to oxidize rapidly above approximately 1,000 degrees Celsius. Fission products would mobilize. Containment, limited in a submarine hull, would be challenged. The scenario was unambiguous: restore cooling or accept progressive fuel. Damage and radiological release within a sealed pressure hull. One consolidated naval history would later state plainly, on its initial voyage on 4 July 1961, pressure in the starboard reactor's cooling system dropped to zero. The phrasing was dry. The implication was not. Loss of forced convection in a pressurized water reactor at sea, without emergency core cooling, meant that the only path to core stabilization lay inside the compartment, where dose rates were highest. The radio silence prevented foreign assistance. The patrol doctrine forbade disclosure. The technical reality imposed a choice: improvise or lose the boat. Morning through midday, 4 July 1961. North Atlantic, aboard K-19. Ventilation blowers continued to circulate air through the reactor compartment and adjoining spaces. Mist condensed on cold bulkheads. Portable dosimeters, carried by damage control teams and reactor division watchstanders, began to register elevated fields. Instruments designed for occupational monitoring, calibrated in millisieverts per hour or milliroentgens per hour, climbed into ranges normally associated with hot cells or fuel handling areas. Not operational submarine compartments. Expectation had been straightforward. Naval reactor operations maintained strict dose limits, with annual exposures measured in millisieverts. Reality diverged sharply. Readings inside and near the reactor compartment indicated fields orders of magnitude higher. Work rotations were immediately shortened. Entry times were measured in minutes, not hours. The radiation environment aboard a submarine following a loss-of-coolant accident combines multiple pathways: external gamma radiation from activated primary loop components and from fission products deposited on piping surfaces. Beta and gamma emissions from airborne contamination dispersed through ventilation, inhalation hazard from radioactive gases and aerosols. Limited shielding in a submarine's confined spaces magnifies exposure rates. Watchstanders and repair teams could not avoid the fields if they were to restore cooling. Later compilations, drawing on post-Soviet disclosures, non-governmental organization reports and declassified summaries, would document the human toll with precision. 8 crew members died of acute radiation syndrome within 1 to 3 weeks of the event. Peak individual doses ranged from 7.5 to 54 sieverts. Numerous additional personnel received doses exceeding 1 sievert. For context, 1 sievert equals 100 rem in older units. 10 millisieverts approximates several months of natural background radiation. The doses absorbed by K-19's reactor division personnel were not occupational. They were acute, whole body, and, for the highest exposed individuals, unsurvivable even with medical intervention. Medical physics in 1961 defined lethal dose thresholds with grim clarity: LD 50/30, the dose. Lethal to 50% of an exposed population within 30 days, absent advanced medical care, was estimated at approximately 3 to 4 sieverts. Doses above 6 to 8 sieverts produced gastrointestinal and hematopoietic syndromes, with mortality approaching 100% given the era's capabilities. A summary from Johnston's archive of nuclear events would later note, The crew improvised a system to supply coolant with personnel exposed to high levels of radiation, including radioactive steam and gases. The phrasing understated the cost. Only restored circulation could arrest core heat up. The work required to restore circulation occurred precisely where dose rates were highest. The solution existed inside the problem. Afternoon, 4 July 1961. Reactor compartment K-19. Engineering division officers staged torches, pipe sections, and a tie-in to the boat's potable water system. The plan was direct: cut into an existing ventilation line, weld in a freshwater feed, establish circulation through the damaged reactor's steam generators, and drive convective heat removal using the ship's freshwater reserve as an improvised coolant supply. No procedure manual covered the operation. Shipyard-grade repair protocols presumed controlled conditions, specialized tools, and time. Aboard K-19, none were available. The work proceeded in stages. First, isolate a section of the ventilation ductwork penetrating the reactor compartment. Second, cut an opening using hand tools and torches. Third, fit and weld a feed line from the potable water system. Fourth, secure the connection under pressure. Fifth, open valves and establish flow. Sixth, monitor steam generator outlet temperatures to verify heat removal. Fresh water was selected because it was immediately available in sufficient volume. Chemically, it was suboptimal. Low conductivity reduced corrosion risk in the short term, but trace minerals and dissolved gases posed long-term material compatibility concerns. Those concerns were deferred. The immediate priority was arresting core heat up before fuel cladding failure released fission products into the hull. Entry times were measured in minutes. Welders and fitters cycled through the compartment in short rotations, limited by dose accumulation. Each man carried a pocket dosimeter. Readings climbed with each entry. Divisional officers coordinated the sequence to distribute exposure, but the work demanded proximity to the primary loop, where fields were highest. A CIA summary, later declassified, would describe the operation concisely. Assemble a non-standard cooling system and use the onboard freshwater reserve. The phrase captured improvisation under duress. Open sources from post-Soviet Russia would add detail. Cut an opening, weld a connection, pressurize the line, and monitor temperature drop. The fabrication was makeshift. The physics were sound. Temperatures in the damaged reactor began to decline. Convective circulation, driven by the temperature difference between the core and the steam generators, removed decay heat. The improvised loop functioned. Contamination, however, dispersed through the ventilation system to adjoining compartments. Airborne activity increased throughout the forward section of the boat. The core was stabilized. The cost was dose. Engineering success and medical catastrophe proceeded in parallel, linked by the same action. The men who welded the cooling loop absorbed exposures that would, within weeks, prove lethal. 4 through 5 July 1961. Multiple compartments, K-19. Readouts from portable dosimeters exceeded scale. Instruments designed to alarm at occupational thresholds. Millirem per hour, single-digit rem accumulated dose, pegged at maximum deflection. Crews exhibited prodromal symptoms consistent with acute whole-body exposure, nausea within hours, skin erythema by the following day. Medical training aboard the submarine presumed scenarios measured in millisieverts. The observed exposures were measured in sieverts. Later consolidations, cross-referencing Soviet naval archives, non-governmental technical reports and post-Cold War disclosures would document peak crew doses ranging from 7.5 to 54 sieverts. 8 crew members died of acute radiation syndrome within 1 to 3 weeks. Numerous additional personnel received doses exceeding 1 sievert. For context, 1 sievert equals 100 rem. 10 millisieverts, 1,000 times smaller, approximates several months of natural background radiation. The gap between occupational norms and observed exposures was not incremental, it was categorical. Medical physics in 1961 provided clear benchmarks. LD 50/30 without supportive care was estimated at 3 to 4 sieverts. Above 6 sieverts, gastrointestinal syndrome predominated, mucosal sloughing, fluid loss, sepsis. Above 8 sieverts, survival was statistically improbable, even with transfusion and infection control. The hematopoietic system, bone marrow, circulating leukocytes, platelets, collapsed within days. Erythema and desquamation marked external beta and gamma burns. Names of the 8 immediate fatalities appear in declassified summaries and memorial records. Additional deaths occurred in the following 2 years, with variants by source reflecting classification, diagnostic coding, and incomplete disclosure. Secrecy clouded totals. Medical files sometimes used euphemistic diagnoses, asthenovegetative syndrome, to mask radiation etiology. One open history states plainly, all engineering team members who participated in the repair died within the next month from radiation sickness. Another notes, 8 died between 1 and 3 weeks after the accident from severe radiation sickness. The numbers are consistent. The outcome was determined not by chance, but by the dose absorbed during the improvised cooling loop fabrication. Later rotations benefited from shortened duty cycles and improved contamination control. Dose accumulation for subsequent watchstanders remained elevated but below acute lethality thresholds. The work that stabilized the core, however, had already exacted its toll. Early high-dose insults were irreversible. Supportive care could extend survival in moderate cases. It could not reverse marrow failure or gastrointestinal necrosis in the highest exposed individuals. As core temperatures stabilized, the medical curve became the new crisis driver. The engineering save ensured the boat's survival. The dose ledger began to define the human cost. 5-6, July 1961, North Atlantic transit, southbound toward Northern Fleet bases, with the long-range radio inoperative K-19 transmitted low-power distress signals on emergency frequencies. A Soviet diesel submarine operating in the region received the transmission and responded. Western naval vessels, monitoring radio traffic as routine Cold War practice, also intercepted the signals. American warships offered assistance. Captain Zateyev refused. Expectation in peacetime maritime emergencies favored international cooperation. Distressed vessels accepted help regardless of flag. Cold War operational security imposed a different calculus. K-19 was a strategic ballistic missile submarine on patrol. The VMA reactor plant, the R-13 missile system, compartment layout, and communications equipment all represented classified information. Doctrine forbade disclosure. Even in extremis, the patrol commander's orders prioritized secrecy over expedited care. Logistics of the tow were constrained by sea state, remaining propulsion capability and contamination control requirements. The responding diesel submarine prepared for cross-decking operations, transferring the most critically exposed personnel while maintaining essential watchstanders aboard K-19. Contaminated clothing and equipment were isolated. Portable dosimeters and decontamination supplies were redistributed. Engineering personnel continued to monitor the improvised cooling loop. Reactor temperatures remained stable, but airborne contamination persisted in ventilation pathways. Zateyev directed stabilization priorities, maintain the jury-rigged coolant feed, control contamination spread, triage the highest dose casualties for transfer, preserve reactor division watch continuity. The decision to refuse Western assistance extended transit time to Northern Fleet medical facilities by hours to days. For personnel already exhibiting prodromal symptoms, nausea, vomiting, erythema, the delay for closed, early interventions that might have moderated outcomes in borderline cases. One consolidated naval history records the sequence matter-of-factly. American warships in the area offered to help, but Zateyev, under orders, refused their help. Another account emphasizes doctrine. In accordance with Soviet Navy policy, foreign assistance could not be accepted. The phrasing varies. The outcome does not. Operational security overrode medical urgency. By the time K-19 approached the Kola Peninsula, the first acute radiation syndrome cases were fully manifest. Hospital intake teams prepared for radiological casualties without complete dosimetry. Pocket dosimeter readings provided rough estimates. Individual dose reconstruction would require correlation with duty logs, entry times, and compartment monitoring data. The information was fragmentary. Secrecy had preserved strategic silence. It also extended the time to definitive care. Medical teams would treat the casualties with the resources and knowledge available in 1961, an era preceding modern bone marrow transplantation protocols, granulocyte colony-stimulating factors, and advanced supportive care. The outcome for the highest exposed personnel was already determined by physics and time. Mid-July 1961. Northern Fleet Naval Hospitals, Kola Peninsula. Admission paperwork documented leukopenia, persistent vomiting, skin burns, and gastrointestinal symptoms. Isolation wards filled with K-19 crew members. Standard naval medicine, treating trauma, infection, and occupational injury, confronted a radiation emergency requiring marrow support, transfusions, infection control, and specialized nursing. Resources were limited. The year was 1961. Modern hematopoietic growth factors, advanced antimicrobials, and refined transplantation protocols lay years in the future. Medical protocols for acute radiation syndrome in the Soviet Union drew on experience from industrial accidents and weapons program exposures. Accounts credit Professor Z. Valinsky and Northern Fleet medical staff with developing treatment regimens that salvaged some high-dose cases. Supportive care included blood transfusions, electrolyte management, infection surveillance, and experimental marrow support measures. Diagnoses in medical files were sometimes coded euphemistically asthenovegetative syndrome to obscure radiation etiology and maintain operational secrecy. The clinical course for acute radiation syndrome follows predictable phases: prodrome, nausea, vomiting, erythema within hours to days, proportional to dose, latent period, transient symptom improvement, manifest illness, marrow failure, immunosuppression, gastrointestinal mucosal breakdown, hemorrhage, sepsis, recovery or death. Time from exposure to outcome correlates with dose. Moderate whole-body exposures, 1 to 3 sieverts, presented as hematopoietic syndrome with survival possible given supportive care. High exposures, above 6 to 8 sieverts, produced gastrointestinal syndrome with near-certain mortality in 1961. One declassified summary notes: many crew members received radiation doses exceeding permissible levels. Treatment included bone marrow transplantation, attempts and blood transfusion. Another states, Soviet doctors treated the men with protocols that were advanced for the period, but outcomes were limited by dose magnitude. The medical effort was real. So were the constraints. 8 funerals followed within 1 to 3 weeks of the accident. The names appear in memorial records, though public disclosure was delayed by classification. Additional deaths occurred over the following 2 years, with variance by source. Some records attribute later fatalities to radiation-induced malignancies or secondary complications. Others cite non-radiological causes. The uncertainty reflects incomplete dosimetry, euphemistic coding, and state secrecy. Supportive care extended survival in moderate dose cases. Men who had absorbed 1 to 3 sieverts during later repair rotations recovered with transfusion support and infection control. Those who absorbed 6 sieverts or more during the initial cooling loop fabrication did not. The physics were unforgiving. Dose determined outcome. Medical intervention could delay death, not prevent it. The engineering save had ensured the submarine's survival. The dose ledger defined the cost in lives. 1961 through 1965, Polyarny Shipyard, SRZ-10, Kola Peninsula, and Novaya Zemlya region. Work orders authorized cutting out the contaminated reactor compartment. Standard practice for damaged naval reactors involved defueling, controlled dismantlement, and disposal of components through designated waste pathways. For K-19, the Northern Fleet chose a different path: remove the entire reactor section with spent fuel still loaded, transport it north, and dump it at sea. The operation proceeded in stages. First, isolation cuts fore and aft of the reactor compartment. Second, installation of temporary shielding and lifting fixtures. Third, removal of the compartment as a sealed unit. Fourth, fabrication and installation of a replacement module containing new VMA reactors. Fifth, transport of the contaminated section to the Kara Sea dumping grounds near Novaya Zemlya. The practice was not unique to K-19. Northern Fleet disposal operations in the Kara Sea included multiple reactor compartments, liquid radioactive waste containers, and damaged fuel assemblies. International scrutiny beginning in the 1990s would catalogue the inventory. The K-19 compartment, dumped in 1965 in Ambrosimovo Bay, Kara Sea, represented one entry in a larger ledger of offshore disposals conducted when land-based storage and processing infrastructure was insufficient or unavailable. Environmental implications were deferred. Immediate shipyard radiological hazards were reduced. The contaminated compartment was removed from the industrial base, and a replacement module restored the submarine to operational status. Long-term environmental liability was exported offshore. Seabed surveys conducted decades later would confirm that the compartment remained structurally intact, with localized releases detectable but contained by the engineering barriers and seabed sediments. One environmental report summarizes the outcome. The 2 damaged reactors from K-19, still with spent nuclear fuel, were taken north to Novaya Zemlya and dumped in the Kara Sea. Another adds, the disposal occurred in Ambrosimovo Bay in 1965, consistent with Northern Fleet practices of the period. IAEA assessments in the 1990s characterized the dumped objects as posing localized risk, with recommendations for continued monitoring rather than immediate recovery. The submarine itself returned to service. K-19 conducted additional patrols through the 1970s, accumulating operational history and further reliability data. The reactor compartment dumped in the Kara Sea remained out of sight, uncharted, and unmonitored for decades. Coordinates were classified or lost. The geographic link between the at-sea emergency and the offshore disposal would not be re-established until the 21st century. The immediate crisis had been resolved. The material legacy had been relocated, not eliminated. 4 through 7 July 1961. North Atlantic Transit, K-19. Engineering notes documented falling temperature trends in the damaged reactor. Propulsion remained restricted. Contamination controls continued. The improvised freshwater cooling loop functioned as designed. Doctrine had envisioned shoreside repair or activation of installed emergency core cooling. Reality, a jury-rigged system fabricated under radiological hazard, prevented further fuel damage at sea. Technical results were unambiguous. No prompt criticality occurred. The reactor remained subcritical following control rod insertion. No large radiological release to the ocean was documented. Contamination remained contained within the pressure hull and ventilation systems. Core heat removal, restored by forced convection through the improvised loop, was sufficient to arrest clad temperature rise and allow controlled cooldown during the tow to Northern Fleet bases. The physics were straightforward. Decay heat, exponentially declining with time after shutdown, could be removed by any circulating coolant with adequate flow rate and heat capacity. Fresh water, though not optimized for reactor chemistry, met the immediate requirement. Temperature decline confirmed that convective circulation was established, and that steam generators were transferring heat to the ultimate heat sink, the ocean, via the secondary side of the plant. One post-Soviet technical summary states, the jury-rigged cooling water system successfully reduced the temperature in the reactor core, averting a meltdown. Another notes, the improvised solution worked, core damage was avoided. The engineering outcome was a success. The human cost remained irreversible. Catastrophe, in the sense of fuel meltdown, containment, breach and radiological release to the environment, was averted. The submarine survived. The reactor core remained geometrically intact. The pressure hull retained its structural integrity. The boat could be towed, repaired, and returned to service. Strategic capability was preserved, yet the dose ledger told a parallel story. The same action that stabilized the reactor, fabricating the cooling loop inside a contaminated compartment, imposed lethal exposures on the men who performed the work. 8 immediate deaths from acute radiation syndrome. Dozens of personnel with whole body doses exceeding 1 sievert. Medical outcomes determined by physics, not procedure. The Northern Fleet would conduct an investigation, assign responsibility, award decorations, and incorporate lessons into training and design standards. K-19 would receive new reactors and return to patrol. Captain Zateyev and surviving crew members would be honored for preserving the platform and preventing a wider catastrophe. The men who died would be buried quietly, their diagnoses coded, their exposures classified. The engineering save was documented. The human cost would remain partially obscured by state secrecy for decades. July through August 1961. Northern Fleet Naval Hospitals. Blood counts were charted against symptom onset. Work party durations were matched to clinical progression. Pocket dosimeter readings, fragmentary and often pegged at maximum scale, were correlated with duty logs and compartment surveys to reconstruct individual exposures. Expectation: occupational radiation protection standards in the Soviet Union. As in other nuclear states, specified annual dose limits measured in millisieverts per year. Actual crew exposures aboard K-19 were measured in sieverts over minutes to hours. Later consolidations, synthesizing Soviet naval records, post-Cold War disclosures, and independent technical assessments report peak individual doses from 7.5 to 54 sieverts. 8 immediate deaths from acute radiation syndrome. Many additional personnel with doses exceeding 1 sievert. For context, 1 sievert equals 100 rem in the older unit system, still in use in the United States. 10 millisieverts, a typical annual occupational limit, approximates several months of natural background radiation. The doses absorbed by K-19's highest exposed personnel were not occupational in any conventional sense. They were acute, whole body, and unsurvivable. Medical physics defines dose-response relationships with statistical precision. LD 50/30, 50% lethality within 30 days, was estimated in the early 1960s at approximately 3 to 4 sieverts without advanced medical care. Threshold for hematopoietic syndrome: 1 to 2 sieverts characterized by marrow suppression, leukopenia, infection risk. Threshold for gastrointestinal syndrome: 6 to 8 sieverts with mucosal necrosis, fluid loss, sepsis, and near certain mortality. Above 10 sieverts, cardiovascular and central nervous system effects, death within days. The engineering choice: enter the reactor compartment, fabricate a cooling loop, restore circulation, mapped directly to the dose absorbed. Duty duration: proximity to the primary loop, ventilation conditions and available shielding, determined individual exposures. Dose, in turn, determined clinical outcome. The correlation was not probabilistic, it was deterministic. One World Nuclear Association summary states, the K-19 accident at sea in July 1961 resulted in 8 deaths from acute radiation syndrome, with doses from 7.5 to 54 sieverts, and many high doses to other crew. Another account adds, the men who performed the repair understood the risk, but proceeded to save the boat. Decorations and honours were awarded. Official records, however, avoided explicit terminology. Medical files coded diagnoses euphemistically. Radiation exposure was implied, not stated. The dose ledger was factual, clinical, and unforgiving. Engineering success and medical catastrophe were two faces of the same decision. The boat survived because men absorbed the exposures required to stabilize the core. 1961 through the 1990s. Soviet Union, then Russian Federation. Orders classified, operational logs. Survivors signed non-disclosure agreements. Medical diagnoses were coded euphemistically. Rosters remained fragmentary. The institutional priority was strategic secrecy, not public accountability or safety transparency. Expectation: industrial nuclear accidents, whether civilian or military, generate documentation, investigation findings, and lessons learned reports that inform subsequent design and operational practice. Cold War operational security imposed a different framework. Information about naval reactor casualties, strategic platform vulnerabilities, and crew medical outcomes was classified to prevent adversary intelligence collection. Public knowledge remained minimal for decades. Reconstruction of the K-19 event relied on multiple pathways. Western intelligence agencies monitored Soviet naval communications and compiled fragmentary assessments. Non-governmental organizations, particularly Bellona Foundation in Norway, documented Northern Fleet environmental practices, including offshore reactor disposals, through field surveys and Russian archival research beginning in the 1990s. The World Nuclear Association Johnston's archive and academic researchers synthesized declassified material, survivor accounts, and technical literature into coherent chronologies. Wikipedia articles aggregated these sources, providing accessible summaries with inline citations. Dose estimates, fatality counts, and technical details showed variance by source. Some references cite 8 immediate acute radiation syndrome deaths. Others add crew members who died within 2 years, attributing later fatalities to radiation-induced illness. Peak dose estimates range from 7.5 to 54 sieverts in most compilations, though some sources report slightly different bounds. The variance reflects classification, incomplete dosimetry, and diagnostic ambiguity. One Bologna Foundation report notes, the first nuclear accident aboard a Soviet nuclear submarine occurred on 4 July 1961 aboard K-19. Another summary states, information about the accident remained classified for decades. Details emerged gradually following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The World Nuclear Association adds, by Russia's third-generation marine pressurized water reactors in the late 1970s, safety and reliability had become a high priority, informed in part by lessons from earlier events. Secrecy delayed safety learning. Design improvements, emergency procedure refinements, and quality assurance enhancements that might have followed prompt disclosure instead percolated slowly through classified channels. Survivor medical care was complicated by incomplete dose reconstruction and reluctance to acknowledge radiation etiology in official records. Environmental accounting, mapping dumped reactor compartments in the Kara Sea, remained incomplete until international pressure and post-Soviet transparency enabled systematic surveys. The documentation gap preserved state secrets. It also obscured the full human and environmental cost of early naval nuclear operations. Only decades later would the pieces assemble into a verifiable historical record: 8 immediate deaths, 1 damaged reactor compartment dumped offshore, 1 submarine rebuilt and returned to service. The ledger was factual. The lessons were hard-won. 1990s through 2021. Novaya Zemlya region, Kara Sea. Survey expeditions, initially conducted by Russian and Norwegian research teams, later expanded with international participation, mapped the seabed using gamma spectrometry, side-scan sonar, and remotely operated vehicles. Survey logs mark targets consistent with reactor compartments, pressure vessels, and radioactive waste containers. Gamma instrument readings confirmed metal objects emitting signatures characteristic of fission products and activated structural materials. Expectation: objects dumped at sea in the 1960s and 70s without precise navigation and in deep Arctic waters were presumed lost. Coordinates uncertain, recovery impractical. Reality: systematic surveys relocated many dumped items, enabling risk assessment and monitoring. K-19's reactor compartment, dumped in Ambrosimova Bay in 1965, was among the objects rediscovered. Coordinates were verified. Structural integrity was assessed. Radiological surveys detected localized releases but confirmed that the primary containment, the steel compartment structure itself, remained largely intact. Seabed sediments provided additional isolation. IAEA appraisals in the 1990s characterized the Kara Sea dumped objects as posing localized environmental risk. Recommendations favored continued monitoring over immediate recovery, citing technical difficulty, cost, and the containment provided by existing barriers. The policy question shifted from where are they to should they be raised or monitored in place. One Barents Observer report states, a Russian expedition has rediscovered the location of the container with 2 damaged reactors from K-19. Another notes, the compartment was located 56 years after dumping, enabling environmental assessment and long-term monitoring protocols. Bologna Foundation advocacy reports emphasize transparency. Mapping legacy nuclear waste in the Arctic is essential for environmental protection and public accountability. The discovery closed a geographic loop. The at-sea emergency of 4 July 1961, documented through survivor accounts, declassified logs, and medical records, could now be linked to a specific seabed coordinate. The human story, the engineering decisions, and the material legacy were no longer separate narratives. They were points on a continuous chain, accident, improvised repair, medical casualties, reactor removal, offshore disposal, decades of obscurity, and finally rediscovery and monitoring. Environmental modelling suggested that radionuclide release rates from the dumped compartment were low, bounded by corrosion rates of steel in cold seawater and dilution in the Arctic Ocean. Risk to marine ecosystems and human populations was assessed as minimal under current conditions. Long-term surveillance, however, remained necessary. Structural degradation over decades to centuries could increase release rates. Climate change, shipping activity, and potential future resource extraction in Arctic waters introduced uncertainties. The submarine, once nicknamed Hiroshima, returned in policy debates. Should legacy naval reactors be raised and processed in controlled facilities, despite technical challenges and cost? Or should they remain on the seabed, monitored remotely, with intervention triggered only if containment degrades? The question had no simple answer. It balanced engineering feasibility, environmental risk, financial resources, and political will. The at-sea emergency had been resolved by human action at human cost. The long-term environmental question remained open, manageable but not solved, a reminder that decisions made in crisis extend consequences across decades. 1961 through the present, a tally compiled from declassified records, survivor testimony, medical archives, and memorial documentation. 8 immediate deaths from acute radiation syndrome, occurring between 1 and 3 weeks after the 4 July accident. Peak individual radiation doses ranging from 7.5 to 54 sieverts. Dozens of additional crew members with doses exceeding 1 sievert. 1 damaged reactor compartment cut out and dumped in the Kara Sea in 1965. 1 submarine rebuilt, fitted with replacement reactors, and returned to operational service. Expectation: a redundant strategic platform, twin reactors, compartmentalized design, overlapping safety systems, intended to ensure patrol reliability and deterrent effect. Reality: a single emitted safety system, a construction defect or operational overstress, and a loss-of-coolant accident in open ocean combined to create a scenario in which only improvised engineering under radiological hazard could prevent core damage. Systemic analysis reveals intersecting factors: design, early-generation naval pressurized water reactors with incomplete emergency core cooling implementation. Construction, quality assurance lapses, schedule pressure, and welding defects. Operations, patrol doctrine emphasizing secrecy and self-reliance, precluding external assistance. Emergency response, improvised fabrication of a cooling loop by personnel who absorbed lethal doses to preserve the platform. Broader context situates K-19 within the arc of Soviet and Russian naval nuclear safety. The World Nuclear Association notes, by Russia's third-generation marine pressurized water reactors in the late 1970s, safety and reliability had become a high priority. The organization's long-arc summary adds, more than 20 radiation-related fatalities occurred across multiple Soviet submarine events. Later, designs incorporated lessons learned. Improvements included installed emergency core cooling systems, enhanced quality control, and refined procedures. Environmental legacy. The dumped K-19 reactor compartment sits within a larger inventory of Northern Fleet offshore disposals in the Kara Sea. International surveys and IAEA assessments characterize the objects as localized sources requiring monitoring. The material remains on the seabed, isolated by engineering barriers and sediment, with low but non-zero release rates. Long-term policy, raise or monitor, remains debated. Human legacy, 8 immediate deaths, memorialized decades later. Survivors received state decorations, though diagnoses remained euphemistically coded for years. Captain Zateyev and engineering division officers were honored for averting a wider catastrophe. The cost, measured in sieverts and lives, was acknowledged obliquely, then more openly as Cold War secrecy gave way to post-Soviet transparency. Improvised engineering saved the hull. People absorbed the irreversible cost. Secrecy delayed institutional learning and environmental accounting. Mapping decades later bound the event to a coordinate, transforming a classified incident into a monitored legacy. The lesson was technical and human. Complex systems fail at the intersection of design choices, operational constraints, and the decisions made when both fail. One final summary, drawn from multiple sources, states the ledger plainly. The K-19 accident at sea in 1961 resulted in 8 deaths from acute radiation syndrome, with doses from 7.5 to 54 sieverts and many high doses to other crew members. The numbers are precise, the memory is preserved. The questions raised about safety margins, transparency, and the price of strategic secrecy remain relevant wherever complex technology operates under constraint.